We'll just keep
take 5
till we get this right. Hello, everyone tuning in. Thanks for doing that. We appreciate your patronage. And by the way, I want to say that if you enjoy our programs and our subjects, please do subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It does help us continue on. We're not in a position to make any money from it, but it keeps us interested. My name is Gary Eelman,
and I'm John Baradino,
and this is The Middle. And we call it The Middle because we couldn't figure out a better name, so we're just stuck with that one for the rest of our lives. Today's subject is critical thinking. In episode 2, we talked about critical thinking as it relates to the engagement of men in their own healthcare. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously a very, very important topic. What we're going to do this week is expand on the idea of critical thinking. Critical thinking helps you come to conclusions that are not faith-based, but data-based. And I think it's really important to talk about this because these days we have a lot of non-critical thinkers that want to take one data source and follow it down a rabbit hole. And this just needs to stop. We need to go backwards in some ways, I think, to science-based conclusions and the data that supports those conclusions. Wouldn't you agree with that, John?
Absolutely. A large portion as to why we wanted to do this program was because we aligned when it came to our perspectives on how we view and evaluate life experiences and our worldviews. So it's nice for us to kind of come together and hopefully provide the audience with a bit of a vantage point that allowed us to get to a point where we could evolve in our thinking and our orientation to various subjects that are important to us. One of them I know we talked about was how we evolved from going from maybe a faith-based perspective in our childhood to then kind of moving into a position where we're able to actively use critical thinking. Now, I relied upon role models. I remember Christopher Hitchens was one of them. Sure. Sam Harris, End of Faith is a terrific book. and then, of course, some of the classics in regards to the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato, even Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher. So what inspired you, Gary? Because that's what I know when we first started talking, I've learned more and more about what influenced you and got you to the position that you're at today and why critical thinking is such an important position to take.
So I think, at least for me, we grow through this critical thinking stage, or grow into this critical thinking stage from certain faith-based things, like Santa Claus, for example, is faith-based. Yeah. Is there a shred of evidence to support a Santa Claus?
There's an origin story somewhere in there, I know.
But no evidence
right.
that he exists.
No reindeer, no North Pole, and all those other things.
Yeah. And then I think, I found out at a very early age that my uncle actually was the Santa Claus in the picture that my brother and I were in, sitting on his lap. And I found out rudely from my brother, who said, "That's Uncle Calvin." And I said, "No, it's not. That's Santa Claus."
It's a shock, right?
It was a shock. And then when I looked beyond the beard and everything, I'm like, yeah, that's Uncle Calvin.
Yeah.
And I think I was 8 years old.
Yeah.
So from there, I was raised Catholic, and even though I went to public school, I went to catechism, and I was given the little blue book. I forget what it's called, the whatever kind of catechism book.
Yeah.
At that age, obviously, I wasn't listening to Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins or any of my now favorite authors.
Yeah.
And so you take it again. Now you're in a faith-based situation, and you find out that you have a soul that you can't see, a God that you can't see, nothing going on there. There's actually literally no evidence for everything that they're teaching you. Nothing.
Right.
And it didn't. My father likes to joke that I wanted to be a priest, which I guess I had told him at one point, until I found out about celibacy, and then then all bets were off. I wasn't going to be.
I think myself and everyone else included who I went to Catholic school with, I think it's important to note that, and I referenced this before in regards to certain admirers that we might have. Growing up in the Catholic faith, going to Catholic church or catechism and whatnot, you look up to priests because they're a symbol of authority and they have information.
Absolutely.
They have a value system and something that we aspire to.
Yes.
So quite naturally so, not only are we influenced by that, but perhaps also indoctrinated by ideas that aren't necessarily ours. The Bible's a collection of stories, essentially. And those stories give meaning to our lives and perhaps provide us with an orientation or goals.
Well, and we're at an impressionable age. We find out about death at a fairly early age. And of course, once we become self-aware that we're mortal, we're looking for answers even at an early age, and it provides that security for us. Now, my personal belief is that many people go on in that same fear zone of, hey, I'm mortal, I'm going to die, what's going to happen to me? And so they justify these faith beliefs, faith belief initiatives and thoughts because of that fear. They justify it as the other part of that is my thought is that people just think they're too important to die. I can't possibly die like my dog does or a bird does or anything like that. And so for me, a human being, there has to be something beyond that. Right?
I think because we're so limited early on in our lives, we're trying to make sense of our lives, and we use narratives in order to do that. The narratives that are provided to us, not just through religion, but also through our parents, our community, our families, and whatnot. So it can give us structure, and it can provide us with security, but it also creates a bias. Yeah. And I think that's where I came to. When I came to a position where I wanted to apply critical thinking to my life, where I wanted to question things. And some, many clients that I work with, they'll talk about these moments that they have in their catechism classes where they started to ask questions to the instructors or the priests or ministers that were there, and immediately they were shot down. Yeah. And they felt a sense of shame or a sense of guilt and a sense of discomfort. But it also then, I think, created an opportunity for them to pivot. I didn't have that, actually. I continued to keep believing for quite some time. And then it wasn't until I said, you know what, I feel like I need to adapt to a different point of view, a different way of thinking. So I could take in new information, I could analyze, I could interpret, I could evaluate some of my previous assumptions that I had, and then start to introduce new ones.
And how old were you when you made that transition?
It was in my early 20s that this occurred.
So you didn't find out about celibacy until your early 20s.
It was one of those things. I mean, I think because I was I was really, really immersed in the Catholic tradition.
I can tell you had sinned many times before.
I'm sure. I know that I did, and I remember going to confession. I remember doing all those things that were taught to me. Yeah. But it created this kind of reductive little bubble in which I felt like, okay, if I do this, then I can do that. If I go to church, then I get that. Yeah. It creates this nice little framework of orientation. Yeah. But like I said before, it also creates a bias. Yeah. And I excluded information that could have encouraged or perhaps stimulated my evolution earlier.
Yeah, so I'm going to quote Ricky Gervais here, and Ricky, you'll never know I did this because we're just not that popular, and I think it's fine because I've cited cited your name anyway. Yeah. But Ricky Gervais was on with Stephen Colbert, and they were talking about religion. I don't know whether you saw.
Yeah, I did see that one.
And Colbert is a Catholic, and he believes in a God, and he was being sort of critical of Ricky, that he doesn't believe in God, and Ricky said, well, so let's go back to when the days when there were 3,000 gods or so. You don't believe in any of those anymore, do you? And Stephen Colbert said, well, no. He said, so you just believe in one? And he said, yeah. And he said, I just believe in one less than you.
Exactly. And it's an interesting point, primarily because, like I said, you're indoctrinated and you're kind of at times maybe even suffocated by that community or that bubble of information that you're so familiar with. But what I wanted to address with it that I thought was so important is a term called cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. And it's a term that's become kind of more accessible in our society today, primarily because of what's been going on politically over the last maybe 8 years or maybe longer. But it's this notion of, because we're so embedded in these comfort zones of orientation and belief, that when new information comes in, it threatens that comfort zone.
Yeah.
And when that threat occurs, it creates anxiety and tension. So we can either open up to it and allow that ambiguity that might come from the new information, or we will double down on what we know and create a tighter kind of network of understanding. So that, I thought that was important primarily because when we're talking about critical thinking, it's more of an expansive experience.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you said, with science, we begin with a hypothesis. I think this might be it, but I'm not sure, and I'm going to test it.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to prove it, and then we come to a place of resolution and results, and then we'll continue to keep testing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't mean to pick on religion. It's just the most obvious one out there. I mean,
it's the most prominent.
You know, we could talk about politics. You could talk about just people's opinions that you
any
talk
ideology.
to. It's any ideology
Yes.
that becomes faith-based instead of using critical thinking to come to appropriate and more logical conclusions. Things that you can say, this table is here. I can touch it. I can feel it. I can measure it. It's 4 dimensions if you really get into quantum mechanics and stuff. But in any event, this is something that we can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, and it doesn't require much critical thinking. I guess what in moving on past religion and when we get past that, the thing that really got me sort of by accident into critical thinking, not knowing what it was, is I became very interested in mechanical things and technical things.
Yeah.
And so I used to do things like, take engines apart and have to put them back together. And I had some limited knowledge that was passed down from my father and my grandfather and that. But by and large, I learned about all of that myself. How does this work? Mm-hmm. And you can't... You can't do that without critical thinking. Everything, you have to take the data that you're learning as it's coming in, and you do create your own hypotheses about each moving piece in an engine, for example.
Yeah.
And then you prove it to yourself. Sometimes you singe all the hair off your face because you didn't think there was going to be gasoline where there was.
Absolutely.
But this is how we learn,
Yeah.
and it's also true of any critical thinking that we do, is we get it wrong, and we get it wrong until we get it right.
It's the infrastructure of the hero's journey, meaning that there's some type of discomfort that occurs at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then something's lost, or something is taken or removed, and then the hero has to go out and experience the discomfort of the trials along the way. And I think we can do that at a macro level. We can do that at a mythical level. We can do it at a micro level of our lives when it comes to individual situations that expose us to discomfort. So I think one of the most important things, going back to Socrates, is I know that I don't know.
Yeah, right. I'm wise because I know. That's what the first words were, right? I'm wise because I know that I don't know.
At the Temple of Delphi, through the Oracle, that was kind of what was known, and on the pillars.
Well, now you're getting way beyond.
Well, no, is that
you're proving you're a doctor now.
Well, I wish this was taught in my doctoral program, but the bedrock of psychology is philosophy. So, and knowing thyself on the pillars of the Temple of Delphi was know thyself and nothing in excess. Live by those two things, and you will be happy and you will live in harmony. But, at midlife, and this is why we're here, we're talking about the middle, we have this there's a crisis of some sorts that we usually go to, where that midlife crisis can occur earlier, can occur later, but it exposes us to a situation where we're forced to challenge some of the old beliefs that we have.
Yeah.
And we can dig our feet into that, and we could say, I'm not going to change. I'm going to continue to believe in Santa Claus. Yeah. Or we can say, you know what? I think this was just a mythical figure from my childhood that allowed me to explain certain things that I didn't understand at the time. And maybe it was a nice kind of rubric for my parents to use, so they could use some conditioning to get me into a place where I would be more disciplined or well-behaved.
Yes.
And I was rewarded for it.
Yes.
Or I was punished for it if I didn't do what was told to me. So I think there's value to us kind of looking at, as we talk about the middle, noticing that we're going to experience the discomfort of a crisis, or we can experience the openness to an awakening. And that's where critical thinking comes into play. I think if we can challenge ourselves to feel exposed to the hypotheses that maybe we haven't uncovered just yet.
My dad, of course, he didn't refer to it as critical thinking, but he did give me some a nugget of advice that I carried, I think, from then on, from the time I told him I was thinking about being a priest.
Yeah.
And what he said to me is, he said, "Look, son, you can be anything you want to be, and I'll still love you. You're still my son. You could do anything you want to do.
Yeah.
All I ask of you," and he said it this way, and he was real serious about it. He says, "All I ask of you is when you're told things, you're given a certain belief, somebody else's belief system, when they try to convey that to you." And this is while I was still, practicing Catholicism. And he said, is take what they say and then think it through yourself. Yeah. Just think it through. Does it make sense to you? Does it ring true?
Yeah.
And he said, "Just do that for me, would you?"
Yeah.
And as soon as he did that, it was literally like somebody flipped a light switch.
Yeah.
In my life, it didn't happen. I mean, to a degree, it happened over time, but that particular talk right there really had an impact.
And what a beautiful moment you had.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened at such a young age, yet today you're still able to reference it and to say, that was a pillar of perspective that enabled me to move forward and to experience the life successes that I've had.
And I'm going to be vulnerable here because part of the reason that we have this video cast going and the podcast is to be able to open up so that other men can learn to open up. And so I need to do that too. I was in an incredibly vulnerable position. I lived with a stepfather who was violent and beat the crap out of my mother, my brother, and me. I only saw my dad on weekends. My dad was completely passive. I mean, he never raised his voice at me. He never laid a hand on me. And so I began to look up to him, I think, as more my escape from the the absolute crap that I lived in, the absolute suffering that I lived in, and I only saw him on weekends. So I paid a lot of attention to the things that he said. Now, I could tell you if my mother or stepfather, had they had the brains to say anything like that, had said something like that, I would have been like, "Fuck you, I'm not listening to you," And
it does depend.
But because he was who he was in my life at that time, it made a big difference to me. And then it progressed through, all my life. And I don't want to pick on religion, put that behind me. I wasn't religious for virtually the rest of my life.
Right.
But it helped me in growing through my career. Yeah. I recognized that I didn't always have the brightest ideas, that we needed multiple ideas to solve a particular situation. I always surrounded myself with the smartest people that I could find whenever I was going up through the ranks. Yeah. And that helped me a great deal. It was that same philosophy of I need to think through this critically, and I need data to do that, and so I take data from all sources, and that would help me.
And I think, again, offering the opportunity to question, and then encouraging your ability and your willingness to then ask those questions or to inquire, to explore, to be curious. I think that was one of the things in my own personal life that I felt actually contradicted my faith. I think what was communicated to me, either implicitly or explicitly, was this notion that if you ask questions, then you're not faithful.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And I think there are other people like myself who probably have struggled with that idea, the notion that you need blind faith in order to be able to experience to God, to have your spiritual experience, or with whatever that relates to in regards to God. So critical thinking is essential, because it offers the opportunity to question and to acknowledge that I've had previously held assumptions about and explanations that are no longer as relevant as they once were.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think midlife is where it's a really, really important opportunity to be able to explore what that is.
Yeah, Ed, speaking about contemporary times, our times right now, I find just an overwhelming amount of people and the talking heads on television programs and so on. Television, listen to me, I'm right out of the early 19th century. Well, the 20th century anyway. Yeah. But I find that there's just a lack, an absolute absence of critical thinking.
Yes.
You find people who take one single source of data, and they're following it. they're going to die on that hill.
Absolutely.
Which doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's like the first thing, and people get irritated with me. They'll say something. It could be political. It could be anything, really. It doesn't matter what it is. But I'll just use politics because we're in this. I don't even know what to call it. We're in this quagmire, surrounded by people who want to think only one way, based on fear or whatever. And I'm going to let you talk about that because you've got the deeper answers. But I just want to finish this thought. Is that when I see people like that and they say something to me, it's automatic with me when somebody says something that isn't obvious, right? Yeah. And so I say, but is that true, really?
Yeah.
And how do you know that?
Yeah.
And people get aggravated with me for questioning it. And yet, this is what we have to do in order to think critically and in order to come to the correct answers. But why do people, that's my giant question for you, the $1 million question here today, if you can answer it. Why do people do that?
I would say this, look, I think it comes back to the protectiveness of how we oriented ourselves early on. So we develop these ideas and ideologies, and from those ideologies, we tend to dig in. Mm-hmm. And then we build bunkers around those ideologies and we stay there. When new information comes in, it can be perceived as a threat and it could be attacking us. So there's, from the traumas or wounds that we might incur along the way, whether those are big traumas or little traumas in our life, trauma is essentially something that kind of injures us to the point where we are forced to either kind of bunker down into protective strategies, or perhaps expose ourselves and say, you know what, that didn't work. Whatever it was that I was relying upon didn't work. You see this very often in addiction. Yeah. And what ends up happening is say, I need to change. I need to change my life. Crises, as I mentioned in the previous episodes that we've had, crises are catalysts to change, and it can either bog you down in the belief system that you once had and the explanatory styles that you relied upon, or it can expose you to opportunities to change. Socrates in the allegory of the cave is an outstanding example of that, where someone comes in and says, look, I've seen these new things, I've encountered these new things, and I'm passing this along to them. Well, what ends up happening is the individual who experienced these new things gets killed, because those new perspectives are so threatening to the embedded beliefs that are already there. Yeah. So we establish what are called heuristics, which are essentially these shortcuts so that we don't have to think too much. Thinking can be difficult. Judging is easy. Yeah. And judging creates separation. We're over here, they're over there, and it creates exclusivity. And you see that a lot in religion. Yeah. You see that a lot in politics. Yeah. And you see that a lot where people are embedded in their ideologies and whatnot. So I do think to some extent what we're talking about here with critical thinking is almost the celebration of ignorance. The celebration of ignorance is essentially, I don't know, but I want to know. Yeah. But I want to know, and I have the ability to learn and to explore what that is. Yeah. I would say stupidity is the opposite. Because that's doubling down.
They don't want to know.
They don't want to know. Yeah. In fact, maybe they might be acknowledging they don't have the ability to know. So there's a willingness and maybe a capacity kind of issue here, though.
I do wonder about the capacity issue, and I you know, Lord knows I don't want to call anybody stupid. I'm not going to say I never do. I do. Yeah. But you do have to wonder: is it a capacity issue? Do they not have the ability? Or is it fear? And that's why I'm always asking you that question. And John knows I've bugged him with this question before. And now I'm doing it publicly, bugging him the same thing. Is it a capacity issue? Is it we don't have us on the side of we're not going to critical think because we don't have the ability, or is it we're not going to think critically about something because we're afraid of the results?
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah, it's tough to kind of lean on one side or the other and say it's this or that. I think you have elements of individuals who have experienced a life and a lifestyle where they've restricted themselves from resources, or they don't have the ability to embrace new resources or resources they don't have access to. I also think to some extent there is fear involved in this because anytime you experience ambiguity or uncertainty, there will be anxiety. I'm sorry to go back to it. Brothers Karamazov, which is Dostoevsky's novel, he talks about this. And But there's this great scene where the Grand Inquisitor is talking to Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's this notion that comes up where the Grand Inquisitor is saying, these people want us more than they want you. They want a church that will give them bread. Wow. And the people will say, make us your slaves, but feed us. Make us your slaves, but feed us. So the notion of being fed is prioritized, meaning safety is prioritized over any insecurity that can come from new information.
Yeah.
So yes, fear is involved, and I think there's also, I think what we would probably have to evaluate on an individual basis, capacity.
Yeah. Sure.
If they have the capacity or not.
So I was watching an interview with Sam Harris, who Sam, if you ever see this, you're like the best, you're tops. But I was watching an interview, and the journalist that was interviewing, it was on a podcast, wants to know why he doesn't have certain people on his podcast that proffer these notions of conspiracy theories and this and that and the other thing. And Sam's answer was just so bang on for me. It was like, yeah, I totally get that. So he's talking about RFK Jr., for example, and he says, here's the thing. He says the reason that I won't debate them is because they'll come on my podcast. And he said, and this is such a simplistic but so true description of what can happen in that situation. He says, it's so easy to make a mess, to scatter the marbles. They can come in and they can cite all of these data points, right? I have no way of verifying them. Yeah. They have no way of verifying them to me. Yeah. And so they come in and they scatter all of the marbles, and it's so easy to do that. But to clean them up and to put them all back is forever. And he said, I just don't have the time or the desire to try and put all of those pieces back together until they make sense.
It's interesting, and you're bringing that up about conspiracy, because I heard that conspiracies are the new religion. Conspiracies are the new religion.
Wow.
They're fueled by intense belief and to some extent illusions.
So if religion, and this has always been my own view of it, don't know whether it's right or not, but if religion is really almost entirely based on fear, right? Yeah. And if the refusal to think critically about something is based almost entirely on fear, and those that don't have the ability, so that we'll call those, we'll call them the people that don't have the ability.
Right.
And does that mean that if conspiracy theories are the new religion, do they follow the same path? Are they based almost entirely on fear?
I would say to some extent, yes, and primarily because what you have here is, if you look throughout the last 2 millennia, you have scenarios in Christianity where there have been heinous atrocities that have been done. The Inquisition, the Crusades.
Sure.
Christians were participating in the Holocaust. The Catholic Church was the first to sign a concordat with the Nazi regime. So you have, you have these scenarios where you say there aren't ethics involved.
Right.
In science, there is a body of ethics. In journalism, there is a body of ethics.
Yeah.
In my profession, there's a body of ethics. There is no ethic in conspiracy.
It's a free-for-all.
It's a free-for-all. So there's no framework of alignment that allows people to see a value system or a moral system or something that keeps people aligned in a way where we can keep each other accountable in a mature way, in a responsible way. There's no sense of responsibility.
None.
You don't. You can lie, you can fabricate, you can embellish and justify it.
Yeah.
That's the crazy and sad, tragic part of it.
Yeah.
And justified. And that's I'm mentioning the last 2 millennia of Christianity because the Christians justified the Crusades.
Yeah.
They justified what they did in regards to the atrocities.
Sure. Absolutely.
And the Inquisition and so on and so forth. So many atrocities can be done in the name of religion in these types of scenarios where critical thinking is not taking place. There is an ethic to critical thinking. There is an ethic to critical thinking. Right. And that's what we're
bizarre to me. I mean, it's an oxymoron, isn't it? In a way.
An ethic in the sense that you are responsible to a particular set of thoughts or ideas where we can align together and we could say, okay, I don't understand this. You don't understand this. Where do we go from there? We research, we explore, we analyze, we evaluate.
Yeah.
We then come back with that information. Yeah. We compare information. We reject or synthesize that information.
So say it again. There's an ethic.
There is an ethic. Yeah. There's an ethic in critical thinking. Now, I'm not saying like I read that.
No. What I thought you said. This is why I got that question from me. Is I thought you said there's somehow conspiracy thinking gun in my head, and you were saying there's an ethic in there, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, what is that? No. There's no ethics at all in that.
No. There's no ethics.
Of course, there's an ethic in critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why papers are peer reviewed, and that's why multiple scientists have to agree on things, and why thoughts are challenged. No, I totally get that. I misunderstood what you said.
But yeah, I mean, so there's a comfort zone that comes from being a part of a conspiracy.
Yeah.
And then, as you can see, it can become cult-like.
Yeah.
I had an interesting explanation. A cult is an example of a small religion. A religion is an example. The religion is an example of a large cult. Yeah, so that's interesting because you have this, this constricted sense of belief, and then you orient and align with it, and then, unfortunately, what ends up happening is you separate, and you say we're good, they're bad, and that's when you have sincere problems. And I think the atrocities that I was kind of referencing there before.
I just, I guess, well, I'm 70 now, so I don't think for the rest of my life I'll ever understand how people can be aligned with a cult like you're talking about, whether it's a religious cult or some other kind of cult.
Fear.
Yeah.
It's fear. I mean, it really, so much of it is fear. Even if you look at...
How many people can be that afraid, though? Everybody, I guess.
I mean, it is one of the most primitive, if not the most primitive, of human experiences is fear. That's the reason why politicians win.
Flight, or believe in a deity.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you have individuals, let's say like Dante, who created this infrastructure in the Divine Comedy of hell and the Inferno. And I mean, wow, talk about a marketing campaign.
Yeah, I don't want to go there.
You don't want to go there. But people saw that or read that or heard the story themselves, maybe because they couldn't read, and they're like, oh my God, I don't want eternal damnation.
And at the same time, so that's the fear of that. At the same time, they offer up an incentive, a reward.
Absolutely.
You can go to golf and play heaven.
Yes.
I mean, go to heaven and play golf.
Yes, exactly.
Or if you've been drinking like me, go to golf and play heaven.
But yeah, it is. You have to provide some incentive.
Yeah.
And it's if you're good enough, or if you align with what we're telling you should do, which is obedience based. It's all what we call operant conditioning.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and that's the kind of the sum of what you experience in a religion, is where you have these two type of primitive emotional experiences or instinctual experiences. Most notably, fear is going to win out because it's survival based and self-preservation based. And you guide people through that.
Yeah.
And you keep them there.
But again, here we are in 2023. Not a shred of evidence for thousands of years that any of this nonsense exists, and yet people are still afraid of it. I mean, it perpetuates. I mean, so many other things that's happened in our history. We've grown beyond. We're out of that, and now it seems to me in our country, where we have a constitution that says Congress shall prescribe no religion, specific religion.
Yeah.
We now have turned it into a religious country.
Yeah.
We literally have people in Congress standing up and saying, including the Speaker of the House, saying that this is a Christian-founded country. Well, it's not.
No.
In fact, it was founded on the basis of freedom of religion.
Yeah.
And this is our framers would be turning over in their grave to hear this nonsense.
Yeah. It's contradictory.
It's completely and utterly contradictory. Yeah. So I guess you would otherwise think this person to be intelligent enough to be the Speaker of the House, to have gone to higher education. I'm a high school dropout with a GED. That's the level of my education, other than flying and a bunch of other things that I did and leadership things that I did. That's the extent of my formal education, and yet I've read the Constitution. I know what the Bill of Rights is, and I certainly understand that this is not a Christian founded nation, and I mean, these things just drive me nuts. So these are not critical. He's not a critical thinker, for example.
No. And I think what we want to point out and highlight is the founding fathers were critical thinkers.
They were critical thinkers.
They were critical
thinkers. They spent an enormous amount of time
absolutely
engaging in critical thinking to make sure that not only the current circumstances were met, but for generations and generations to come.
Yes.
And I just don't understand how we got where we are. And now the second $1 million question for you to answer is, how do we unscrew ourselves from this fucked place that we're in? Pardon my French.
Well, I think when someone comes into my office, the first question I ask them is, what is the central problem?
Yeah.
And be specific.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I'll ask them to prepare that before they come in. We have to identify what the problem is, and we have to be very candid and I think vulnerable when it comes to revealing what that is. If we leave things out, or we try to candy coat things, or sequester something because we don't want to harm or offend another person, we're going to do a disservice to each other. The problem that we would have here is that we wait for a crisis to occur at a national level, a domestic level. And then that drives the incentive and urgency to change. And of course, we don't want that to happen. Nobody wants that. Well, I shouldn't say some people might want that. Some people are advocating for a civil war. Yeah. Some people are advocating for the end of times.
Oh, my God.
So that's what I'm saying. Even within certain Christian traditions and denominations, they are actually hoping for the end of times.
I'm going to become. I think the answer to this is I need to become an evangelist type of preacher, but my dogma is not related to religion.
No.
It's going to be if you don't engage in critical thinking, the punishment is you're going to be a stupid idiot and make horrible mistakes in your entire life.
Yeah.
And so much of that is really true. I mean, I just don't know what else or who else or what other possible reasoning you could use with somebody who's stuck in that rut of I'm believing what I believe, and that's that.
I think, again, and we're going to have an episode that talks about masculinity, manhood, what that means.
Yes.
But I think really what it's going to come down to is the ability to allow vulnerability, the courage that it takes to be vulnerable when it comes to saying, I don't know, but I want to know. Yeah. I don't know, but I want to know. And I'm observing things that are unsettling to me. I'm not going to allow the emotion to take over, but I'm allow that can be a piece of information. Emotion is a data point, but it's not the only data point. And I think that's so. So awareness of one's ignorance is a sign of intelligence.
Yeah.
And we need to promote that, Gary. Yeah,
I think I said in our first podcast that and I don't know whether this made it through or not in the editing, but I said that I had gotten sick of all the emails and everybody was right and everybody was afraid to be wrong, and I decided to start putting on the bottom of my emails, I could be completely wrong.
Absolutely.
I would express my opinion and then say I could be completely wrong, because you can at any time, and to not acknowledge that is irrational. It's completely irrational.
Yeah.
And in the same sort of irrational thinking occurs to me when you're thinking about people who are stuck on something and they're going to believe it no matter what. No matter what you show them. Here, look, here's a picture, and this is the Empire State Building.
Yeah.
I don't buy it because I'm not sure that ever got built. I mean, things like that. It just seems crazy to me.
It's interesting primarily because what we want to try to do, and even if you take, so I come from a tradition where I'm inspired by Carl Jung, and he also inspired other people like Joseph Campbell, who referred to what's called the monomyth, which is this notion that there's one myth essentially, and there are many different cultures and historical features. And the story is essentially the same, and it just runs through all these different time periods and different cultural dynamics. But and that goes back to Jung saying there's this kind of archetypal element that we all have the same DNA and the same story. Mm-hmm. But when we try to create exclusions and saying, no, my story's better than yours, then we start to create separation. So the fundamental and foundational myth of Western civilization is the Jesus myth. And the interesting thing is Jesus was advocating for letting go of your old assumptions that tied you to very, very narrowed points of view.
Sure.
He said that, and he said it most notably through the community.
Yeah.
He said, you have allegiance to your mother and father.
Yeah.
If you put that before, he's saying me, but he's essentially saying whatever your life purpose is, whatever your soul, whatever that might represent, if you put that before you, then you are going to remain in a terrible, terrible state.
Yeah.
So you have to make a sacrifice. You have to sacrifice old assumptions. And that is terrifying to do. So everybody who comes into my office, what they say is, I didn't know if I could call you, and I was so frightened, and I feel better now because I trust, But I feel that going into the therapy is the singular most courageous thing that a person can do. I believe that. I believe that. It's a core belief of mine.
So ironically, I love that word. But anyway, ironically, I have read the Bible cover to cover, of course, when I was younger. And before I made the decision to completely discard religion out of my life, I did there are some very, very good points, as you mentioned, in the New Testament that Jesus said. And a couple of it stuck with me. And you look at these people who are very, very wealthy. They claim to be Christians. This is a Christian country, and I take money from super PACs, and I've got millions and millions of dollars. And the irony in that, and the disgusting part of that is that if they claim to be Christians, like Trump holding the Bible upside down outside of a church. Come on.
Or signing it.
Yeah, or signing it. Does anyone believe that this guy believes in anything but himself? But, the point I was making is they pretend to be Christians, and yet if they actually read the Bible, they read the New Testament, and they read what Christ said and understood his meanings, there's no Christ would bat them in the head with
100%.
100%.
Yes.
I mean, Christ once said, if you have two coats, you have one too many. Give one to your neighbor, and that's as simple as you can make it, right? Like we don't need to collect these material things. And his whole point was you didn't need material things, and yet that's all they do. And another point, Christ was talking to his disciples, and he said, you've, and I can't get the quote right, but you'll get the idea. He said, you have done blessed work whenever you have visited me in prison, whenever you healed me when I was sick. That's the thing. And so they said, when did we do this, Lord? And he said, when you did it for the least of my brethren, you did it for me. Right. And you think about that and you say, that's really a profound thing. That's really a profound statement that he made.
It is.
And then you look at the con artists and the cultists and the conspiracy theorists, and who all claim to be Christian people. And it just drives me freaking nuts. And I could never be a psychologist that you are, because I would stop people at the door and I'd open it. I'd have to give them a complete interview, and I'd say, "Are you capable of critical thinking?" And if they say no, I'm saying you're stupid. Well, you go away.
I think what I know is that these narratives, these stories that the individuals tell themselves, that they create walls. There's walls around those stories, and that it's a very desperate time when they come into my office. There's a crisis of some kind. So compassion and empathy are huge portions of what allow me to access them.
Yes.
And so, I want them to be able to do that with themselves when it comes to parts of themselves. But expansion comes at a cost.
Yeah.
There is sacrifice involved. There is ambiguity and anxiety and discomfort. It takes courage to change. And I think adopting a mindset that says, I'm going to be a critical thinker, I'm going to pursue critical thinking, it's you opening yourself up to uncertainty.
Yep.
And it's a kind of crucifixion.
Yep.
The myth has value because it exposes us at an unconscious level to the parts of ourselves that we've neglected and rejected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So full circle, then. Full circle back. So we started out this video cast by talking about critical thinking and how that related to the last episode that we did with men's health, and how it's important to be engaged. There's more to come on that. I think there's more that we could talk about. We've got some feedback that there are some things we could cover in men's health that could be important. But just bringing it back full circle from today, from religion, politics, and then just these conspiracy theories and everything. I'm just going to make my own statement here, which is that if you want to live your life in a true way, being true to yourself and not pretending to be somebody else, but more importantly, in a way that gets you where you desire to be, critical thinking needs to be a critical part of that, and it's the way life needs to be in order for human beings to progress.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we remain in the state of fear that John's talking about. Yeah. We imagine things that don't exist. We create things that don't exist and imagine that they're there. This is all part of the critical thinking process, and I'd like, we're out of time, but I would love to spend more time on this. Again, if you like the program, it's called The Middle, and please give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe so we can stay at this and get into interesting subjects like this. Also, please give us your comments, good or bad. We're interested in everybody's viewpoint, and I think for now we're out of here. I'm Gary Illman,
and I'm John Veradino,
and we'll see you.
Take care.